Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name's Chloe McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb, and I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on the impact of housing on the health of Youngstock. Our presenter this evening is Nick Gibbon from Belmont Farm and Equine Vets Limited, and Nick has worked as a vet for 10 years. So the plan of action is that Nick will run through a 30-minute presentation and then there will be time for questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if you would like to ask a question, then please type your question into the box on the side of your screen. If you can't see this box, you might have to click the orange arrow to open this box up. I will then ask Nick your questions once he's finished presenting. So hopefully we won't have any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So I'll now hand over to Nick.
Hello, good evening, everybody. First, I think I'd start a little bit about me. I'm a livestock vet. I practice, my practice is based in Herefordshire, and we're really lucky in Herefordshire. We've got lots of calf rearers, rearing, quite a few systems rearing over 1,000 calves, clients that do more than that as well, and then a lot of people under there doing sort of 500 to 1,000 calves. There's a lot of straw in Herefordshire, and there's lots of mixed agriculture going on. And historically, it's been a place that people have been able to buy calves from the marches and from into Wales and bring them over here and rear them. So there's a good calf rearing heritage and lots of it happening. And that's one of the reasons why 2 years ago I was asked by the AHDB to facilitate a discussion group specifically for beef from dairy calf rearers. And so we started out with a discussion group, and we gathered a lot of data, and things have slowly evolved. And then at the end of that, they've asked me to do a webinar really looking at housing and discussing some of the findings from the discussion group. So this evening, I think I'll give a bit of background to this group of calf rearers, the key findings from their data, how these things are relevant to other people rearing calves. We'll look a little bit about housing design and how that is affecting baby calves, what is unsuitable, what is suitable, potentially throw around some ideas of how to improve your housing. And yes, the main focus is beef from dairy calf rearing, but the second part of the talk is relevant to all calves, so very much dairy heifers as well, or certainly calves on farm of origin. So the calf rearing group was made up of 8 calf rearers, rearing between 500 and 1,200 beef from dairy calves a year, generally from 3 weeks of age up into about 140, 150 kilograms. They're largely supply chain, so contracts or buying and selling back into supply chains, and most of them are rearing from multiple sources. The key focus was discussion and learning amongst those in the group. It was one of the more rewarding things I've done actually as a vet is facilitating a discussion group, and the farmers appeared to get a lot out of it. We had some great speakers on nutrition, housing and disease coming, and we had a chap come from the States to talk to us about housing, and he had some really interesting ideas, and then independent nutritionists and another vet talking about disease. So we had a good program. Part of the deal for the AHDB was that the calf rearers would record some data along the way. So we recorded, or we got them to record as much data as possible about each calf that went through each of the systems. So we had calf breed, sex, disease, status, weight, arrival, weaning and leaving, farm of origin, ear tag, lots and lots of other variables were recorded by the farmers. And this was really, the idea of this was for the AHDB to gather a bit of information into what's going on, what the challenges are. We got a good amount of data from the group. There were 3,000 calves with weight data, so 3,000 calves with 3 weights, which was quite interesting to have a look at. And then there were 1,500 calves with full health and weight data across the 8 farms. So we had 1,500 calves with some good start to finish records of incidents of pneumonia and scour and any other things that went wrong along the way. And so there were lots of findings. We dragged out lots of information out of all the data, and some of those findings had some statistical significance. Others were just, a useful remark, really. We spent a lot of time drilling into that data to have a look at some of the things that are affecting the calf rearing environment, the calf rearing business. And some of the things were quite interesting. Obviously, our main focus, my main focus as a vet, was on disease incidence and the effect that disease incidence was having on the calf rearing process. So, is it affecting growth rate? Is it affecting days on farm, etc., etc.? And some of the calf rearers, or some calf rearers I've heard sort of previously remark that pneumonia, yes, it costs to treat, and yes, there is a risk of losing the calf, but it doesn't necessarily have the cost that we talk about in terms of growth rates. Well, even in those 1,500 calves, it was quite obvious that calves with pneumonia were staying on farm for longer than calves without. So pneumonia in the calf rearing environment is having actually quite a big cost in terms not only of treatment and potential losses, but also in its lost efficiency. So in the group, the group in the 1,500 calves that had health data, if you'd had half the number of cases of pneumonia, they could have reared another 200 calves in a 12-month period. So if you think about it in terms of lost days on farm against your fixed costs and variable costs, etc., then or a loss potential, then there's considerable cost in the calf rearing environment of a case of pneumonia. So focus really has to be on preventing pneumonia. Other things we found that certain categories of calf onto farm were at greater risk of developing pneumonia. So very small calves, as this graph shows, had a higher pneumonia rate. Heavy calves were at less risk of developing pneumonia. And we spent a lot of time drawing things like this out of the data. One of the other things that we looked at was the makeup of the batch. So the number of sources in each batch. And this was quite an interesting finding. It's obvious in hindsight, but this was quite stark in that if you look on the left-hand side of this graph here, the few groups that we had through that were only coming from one or maximum 2 sources had many fewer cases of pneumonia in them compared to the groups that went through that were made up of big numbers of sources. And this is purely because the numbers of variety of each of the individual viruses and your common cold equivalents, the different varieties and types of mycoplasma, etc. If you mix up 10 different farms, you've got potential high variety there. So potential for calves that are naive or not immune to come across diseases that they've never seen before and therefore develop disease is much greater. And so that was quite an interesting exercise. It's kind of obvious. It's nice to see it in black and white. So what do we do with this information? So we basically built a model that was going to try and sift between all these different factors and work out which of these variables was creating the greatest risk for pneumonia. Things that we didn't put into the model or didn't have information for are in the red box on the right. And it was a shame that we didn't have all the calf health data. That was really, we were sort of missing half the calves in that window that we got weights for. But that's just the nature and the complexity of recording. One of the big things that we sort of all agreed upon was that there is not really a strong recording system for calf side health, weight, etc. recording that is that generates a nice simple list of a history or anything like that that we could then use in this way. There are recording systems out there, but they're not always necessarily straightforward to get that data out of. So it seems to be a bit of a gap in the market for an app or something where you would have the calf ID and then a series of drop downs where you could simply record everything and it would spit out a report at the end. In the calf group, there was one major sort of link, unfortunately, with some of the data, is that in the feeding system and the housing systems were completely linked. All of the calves that were fed on automatic machines were housed in igloos, and all of the calves that were fed through teats, buckets, were housed in traditional sheds. So there was very much an interaction there between the two, which makes it hard to drill out which is having a bigger effect, housing or feeding system. They're interlinked, so we couldn't split them out. So the greatest risk, when all of those factors were taken into account, was season of arrival on farm, with winter and spring posing the greatest risk. Spring 2018 just didn't really ever arrive. It was a very drawn out cold winter, and so the calves were under a lot of stress. Other years we might expect autumn and winter to present this challenge, but actually in this model, in this time period, winter and spring were by far the worst. But the greatest risk of pneumonia was a season of arrival. The next biggest risk was posed by feeding system, but as I said, feeding system and housing were completely intertwined, so very hard to tease those apart. The batch risk category was next, so calves that were coming in batches that were coming off huge numbers of farms were in a worse position than calves that were coming in from 1 or 2 farms on a batch. Again, not surprising. And breed category was last, so we categorized the Holstein bulls against the continental calves, and unfortunately they came out as being more likely to develop pneumonia. Now, is that a lack of hybrid vigor? Is it a difference in value of the calf and possibly different treatment at farm of origin? It's possible. There's lots of factors that could be contributing, but they definitely had a greater risk of being treated for pneumonia. As I said, the once a day feeding and the housing types were closely linked to the feeding and the housing types were closely linked. So it was very hard to tease these apart. Housing and season are really important. We can't alter the seasons, but as you know, as I put down at the bottom, you can change your housing. So it's the point, I suppose, is, and the rest of this evening's webinar, is that season poses the greatest risk of pneumonia, i.e. undesirable weather conditions. So therefore our focus must be on providing the best conditions in the unfavorable weather conditions. So poor housing and ventilation leads to poor air quality, okay, and air quality is everything regarding pneumonia. So poor air quality means basically anything that is an insult to that calf's airway. It could be actual viruses causing disease, could be bacteria, and I think things that are underrated, dust and ammonia, and they will cause actual damage to the hairs that line the windpipe and other aspects of the airway, and they'll allow in then secondary infections, and they'll make it much easier for the virus and the bacteria to invade. So poor air quality ultimately is a lack of air turnover, or air quality problems are exacerbated by a lack of air turnover, and that damages those lungs and allows that calf to develop pneumonia. Once calves are over 3 weeks of age, it's the biggest cause of mortality, certainly in the group of calf rearers data and in our clients. Aside from a couple of weird and wonderful things, pneumonia is the biggest cause of mortality. Under 3 weeks of age, it tends to be scour related, but in a beef and calf dairy calf rearing environment, most of the calves that are in the systems are over 3 weeks of age. So getting the housing right really has potentially some really good benefits. This is a graph which probably people have seen before. It's from Ken Nordland, University of Wisconsin, and it shows really nicely actually how our air quality and respiratory disease are linked. So in this study, they used airborne bacteria counts as a measure of air quality. And this is an approved way of assessing air quality. So if you look along the bottom axis there, you've got your lowest bacterial counts on the left and your highest on the right. And then up the left hand, up at the vertical axis, you've got the prevalence of respiratory disease. So there's quite a clear trend there that in the instance where you have high levels of bacteria or poor air quality, you have an increased rate of pneumonia. And then the various different colors and shapes that you can see within those lines are then the calves grouped in terms of how they're housed within their pens. So if you look at the bottom there, you have a good description. And those calves that are deep nested and have the presence of a solid barrier, so they'd be individually penned and they have loads of straw, are at the least risk of developing pneumonia. So they are completely free from draft, so they've got presence of a solid barrier. They are able to nest deeply, and only when air quality really, really declines do they develop. Are they possibly able to develop pneumonia? And you can see them here. So the deep nesting and the absence of draft, when the air quality is really clean, there's very little evidence. As air quality declines to being really bad, only then do those calves come at risk of developing pneumonia. So the calves at the other extreme are up here. So these calves have got minimal nesting and the ability to no ability to nest at all, and the absence of a solid barrier. So there's potential for draft over these calves, and they have no way of protecting themselves from the cold. So this just shows quite nicely that air quality is a major driver, but the other factors then within that housing environment are also supporting or otherwise increasing the risk of developing pneumonia. So what have our focuses got to be? So maximize air quality by ensuring excellent ventilation without a draft and keeping environmental moisture to a minimum. So that environmental moisture, excessive amounts of humidity or environmental moisture will allow calves to chill, especially in cold weather, and potentially they act as the extra moisture in the air acts as a way of pathogens, so viruses and bacteria, to transit between calves, and excessive moisture around the feeding apparatus, etc., is normally the source of this. So our responsibility is to provide good ventilation and reduce that moisture, and then to support the calf by providing conditions that allow the calf to stay warm and providing correct dietary calories for growth and immunity at the same time. And temperature is important. So this is from AHDB's really useful housing booklet. So we're looking here at lower critical temperatures, continental bred steers. Those steers that are fed a pretty poor energy density diet, 100 kilogram animals. So we're looking at beef from dairy calf size on a relatively low energy density diet. The lower critical temperature for those animals is 4.7 degrees. Lower critical temperature is the temperature at which the calf uses calories to stay warm instead of growing. So if you're not feeding them many calories, then they can't put up with much temperature stress, is the summary really. if you're, and there's a bit of a strange position in the middle of this table where these calves will put up with lower temperatures, but in summary, the more calories you feed, the lower the temperature the calf will put up with. Very few people will be feeding diets much higher than this. So if you've got 100-kilo animals, then you're not going to, then as soon as it gets below zero, they're going to be burning calories to stay warm instead of growing. And then other things will start to give. So their ability to fight infections, their immune status, etc., becomes compromised. So keeping the calf warm as well as well ventilated is an important consideration. So what does well ventilated mean? So that's basically providing enough air changes per hour for the calves. Historically, people sort of discussed 4 air changes per hour, but that's been fairly well disproven, and at least 8 to 10 air changes per hour, even in the winter, moving to a sort of a maximum of 60 in hot conditions. The 8 to 10 per hour in the winter, I would say, is rarely achieved in a traditional shed environment, and when the weather gets cold, generally people are closing down sheds and trying to keep the calves as warm as they can, and then that compromises upon air changes. Why do we want air changes? It's removing that poor quality air, and that poor quality air is inevitable. Calves produce moisture, urine, feces. You're feeding them wet feeds. It comes through their skin. There is a lot of moisture around, and that, along with ammonia and all the pathogens and dust that we discussed, etc., that is making poor quality air, and that we need to move that away from the calf. Really simple way to assess this, using a fogger or maybe smoke bombs, creating a wet straw fire in a can in a wheelbarrow somewhere safe in the shed. It's a really simple way to assess it. You start the clock, and once everybody's in agreement that it's gone, that's your air change. And everybody should be doing that, really, and having a look at what their sheds are like, or doing it with someone that has some of that equipment. One of the biggest challenges is getting people to allow their calf sheds to ventilate in the winter, especially traditional housing. There's a feeling that obviously we need to wrap calves up and keep them warm, which is true. They don't want to be cold, as we've shown with that lower critical temperature graph, but being badly ventilated and not having good air quality, as you can see from that graph, the Ken Lordland graph that we went back, from previous slides, actually, most important is air quality. Most important is air quality. There's a range of risk associated with the nesting, etc. But if you can ensure you've got the air changes per hour as the primary thing, and then provide the straw to nest in, or potentially coats for smaller calves, or small micro environments for them to hide in within this calf environment, if you can provide the air changes primarily, then all those other things become bonuses. So what does well ventilated mean? It means inlet and outlet, space for the air to move into the shed and out of the shed. For every meter squared of inlet space, you need 0.5 to 0.25 the amount of outlet, or flip that around. For every meter squared of outlet, there must be 2 to 4 times sorry, the amount of inlet. And it's really basic fluid dynamics. If air is flowing out, or if you're expecting air to flow out, you must provide as little resistance as possible for air to flow in behind it. Or, which is what probably should happen in more calf rearing environments, especially in traditional sheds, you force air in, and then the air moves out because you're forcing it in using energy. So sources of inlet in most calf sheds, traditionally naturally ventilated calf sheds, most of the time that's through boarding. So it's an imperfect wall, it's a perforated tin, or spacer boarding, Yorkshire boarding. In most calf houses, We'll go through the stack effect and things in a second, but in most calf houses, that inlet is acting as outlet as well. And we're looking at really just a cross flow or areas of the building where the wind catches the corner and sucks air out of the corner and things like that. And that's how that calf house is ventilating. It will be ventilating very differently on a stilt day to a windy day. The prevailing wind will be affecting the ventilation. So it's, yes, there is space for the air to move in and out, but it's not predictable, it's not consistent. So on a still day, often those simply boarded sheds are, they're really not ventilating particularly well. If you are putting boarding up, and this is Jamie Robertson, who's a buildings sort of very much a guru, he goes on and on about this, and rightly so. If you're putting boarding up, then be clear. Is it spacer boarding, which is basically a board with a gap, or are you talking about proper Yorkshire boarding, which has 2 layers of boards with a space in between them, and then the space on the outer board overlaps with the where the inner board is positioned, and you can see here you get double the amount of inlet through that board. So Yorkshire boarding is providing a lot more inlet. It also protects the inside of the shed from rain really effectively without compromising upon airflow. Obviously, this costs considerably more because you have a lot more wood involved in its construction, but it provides better ventilation. If you're going to specify you'd like Yorkshire boarding, make sure that it's Yorkshire boarding rather than spacer boarding that you get. Other ways of providing inlet or outlet in these traditionally naturally ventilated sheds, doorways or windows, but don't forget to open them. Shuttered sides, again, don't forget to open them or close them. Gale breakers, again, don't forget to open them. Or potentially forced ventilation as a solution. All those sort of manual ventilated methods up above here, they're great in theory, but time and time again, I go on farm on a still day in November, it's not too cold and the calves are shut in, and we didn't open the shuttered sides today, or we didn't open the blinds today, and it's not automated. People are very busy on farm, labour short, etc., and expecting this to be done is perhaps it's a bit unachievable on some farms. So forced ventilation is often a solution. This is a nice tube setup. And it's basically the tube was built to fit the shed. And it's just blowing air onto the calves. It's acting as the inlet, and then the outlet is through the perforated tin. We'll go back to this picture later on. There's something that I want to point out in that picture that could be improved upon. In this instance here, again, we've got a tube running down the length of the building. That's acting as your inlet. Outlet today is really limited. So this blind is pulled down and there's a little gap here. There's some space in the roof, but these are clear panels. So and then this isn't perforated tin. So you're pumping air into that building using energy, and it's not really able to escape particularly easily. Something to bear in mind when you're putting a tube in, if a tube is an option, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is that outlet is, thinking about where your outlets are is important, or how that building is going to ventilate. I fogged a building the other day into the tube, and it was going full pelt. It was actually going too quickly, and air was coming out at one end. It wasn't uniformly ventilating the shed, which is quite interesting. And then it was sitting and circulating at that one end of the shed, and there was simply nowhere for it to get out. So you could see the calves were just sitting in waves and waves and waves of the same air that was just being circulated around their heads at one end of the shed. And then at the other end of the shed, it was completely still, and the calves weren't receiving any air at all. So it's nowhere for anything to escape. So it's still, even though you're pumping air into the shed through the tube, you need to bear in mind that it has to get out somewhere. So outlet, don't over rely upon the stack effect with baby calves. They really struggle to make it work. They generate very little body heat, and the air doesn't rise particularly far above them. So you end up with a situation with air just circulating on top of the calves. The sheds are built with outlet in them. You see lots of calf sheds that have got open ridges, etc. But does the air make it up to actually escape through the outlet? Quite rarely, unfortunately, in naturally ventilated sheds. So one of the solutions is to look at adjustable side walls as an option for inlet and outlet at the same time. But these then also need to be managed on a day-to-day basis. So they're not always a solution. So just a little bit on natural ventilation. Everybody's seen the stack effect before. It basically relies upon the animal's body heat generating an updraft, and then that sucks air in through the inlets at the side of the building. Nice big animals generate a nice big updraft, and it all works. Lots of calculations have gone into this over the years, and it can be calculated quite accurately to the body weight of the animal, etc. The floor area, the stocking density, the inlet space, outlet space can all be worked out, and it will work. Unfortunately, when you put little tiny bodies that don't generate a huge amount of heat into that same space, the air moves up and then falls down and doesn't ever make it to the roof, and it doesn't drive that draw through the inlet. So you end up with poorly naturally ventilated sheds if you're using those calculations for calves. If you lower the eaves, so if you try and stick to the sort of the fluid theory of driving that air out of the top of the shed and lower the eaves, then it potentially there's potential that at high stocking densities it might encourage air to move up and away. But these sheds have really have low eaves, and they're very difficult to clean out if they're not designed well, and often you hear that, well, I hear quite frequently, well, we can't build a shed of that height because what else would we use it for? Well, that's a very good point, and hence people are hesitant to do this. If you're going to build a bespoke calf building that's just going to be used for calves, then would you invest in a shed, or would you potentially use some of the other technology that's out there? If you're putting up a shed that you'll rear calves in and then use for other things, this is probably not the design. But so what people do, instead of having the low, going for the low shed and trying to force those animals to create a stack effect, what you see most commonly is the same height of shed, or a usable height of shed, and then huge, great big inlets cut at the wall. So either having flaps here, or potentially having blinds here, but basically allowing those calves to ventilate with as much air as you like over the top of them, just to get air into the shed, basically. The only challenge with that is that in very blustery, cold conditions, the calves are potentially at risk of really feeling the impact of the cold weather and the wind. So the emphasis has to be on how to minimize this. We talked about variable sides, so options for variable sides, shuttering and blinds. The other potential option is to create a space within that environment, so where you've got plenty of air blowing over them in a really open, airy shed. If you've got little calves in there, you need to create a cubby hole essentially for them to hide away in. And this is one of the reasons why the igloos and the large hutches work so well, is that they're in the calf outside area is really well ventilated, and then they have a place where they can hide and get warm as and when they need to. They have a choice. If you force calves into these very, very open sheds in cold conditions, they haven't got a choice. They can't hide from the draft, and if they can't nest, then they're going to get chilled, and you're going to have negative health effects. All of the calculations and things that you need, I'm not going to go through that this evening, they can be found in this really good document, Better Cattle Housing Design, and that details the height of the eaves. It details the outlets the inlet, DOTL floor space, stocking density, loads of different factors. So if you're putting up a shed and you want to try to ventilate it naturally, which for baby calves is not a good idea, but if you want to try to ventilate it naturally, then that gives you some guidelines on calculations, etc. So as I've said, often in these naturally ventilated sheds, inlet and outlet are interchangeable. So air is coming through the sides and leaving out of the sides as well. And as we're kind of coming to the summary of, really, baby calves of 0 to 12 weeks of age are really difficult to house in these types of sheds. The air dynamics don't work, as the stack effect doesn't work. They don't drive the airflow out. So calf-specific housing or mechanical ventilation are much better options for calves. So mechanically ventilating traditional sheds, or potentially, investing in another option. We have quite a few clients with igloos, and we have quite a few clients with using large hutches as well, housing multiple calves in small micro calf environments, and they do work really well. Basically, it's providing that calf with a space small enough for it to actually generate the heat, to move the air away from it, and they're shaped, specifically igloos are shaped fantastically well to pick up even small amounts of airflow and to funnel that over its chimneys and draw air out as well. So the calves are really driving the air movement through these environments, and they can be really humid and warm environments, but because the air changes in them are relatively high because of the unique design, that humidity is constantly leaving. So even though there can be a bit of a whiff in an igloo, air changes per hour are really high. So you're getting rid of that poor quality air really quickly. It's warmer than being in an exposed shed environment as well. They're very much, they're a very sheltered environment for calves, and they're normally situated where the calf can access an exposed area outside, so it can moderate. It can moderate its body temperature. If it's hot, it can go outside. If it's cold, it can go inside. It's got a choice, and therefore it will look after itself. Mechanical ventilation is often the only solution for calf housing, especially if that shed's been designed or is used for other things as well. It's ultimately creating a big inlet and forcing air into the shed, allowing it to make its way out. Now that may be through the roof, given that the most tubes that are pointing directly down at the ground, most of the outlet actually is through the sides. When you start fogging these sheds, it's through sides and gaps just above calf level rather than the ridge itself. And the tubes work really, really well when calves are able to nest. So when they're able to make themselves warmer, so in cold weather you can achieve good air changes per hour and the calves can stay warm. They work really well when coupled with deep straw. So that was what I was going to come back to in this image here, is that the tube, it's lovely to have the tube and it was running and this was a cold day, but the calves have got relatively little, they're embedded on what looks like rape straw. They've got really very little ability to nest. So if we had very cold conditions in this shed, yes, we're getting our air changes per hour, which is great for ventilation, and it should be our main goal, but we're risking the calves chilling here. So if they don't develop disease, if it gets under their lower critical temperature, then if they don't develop disease, they will not be growing. So any feed you're putting into that animal is not really doing the job we want it to. So that was my point there, really. And in that image there's more straw, but again, it could be better. And if you're forcing air into a shed through mechanical ventilation, you need to provide more straw for that calf to nest in cold conditions. And this is a nice image from Ken Nordland's publication on calf housing that I took the graph from. That calf's able to bury its legs. Extremities are really good places for animals, us, calves, any animal to lose heat from. So if it can bury its legs, then that's a good start for reducing temperature loss. So going away slightly from ventilation, another focus of good calf housing is reducing environmental humidity. Calf housing generally has high levels of environmental moisture. Why is that bad? It chills calves in cold temperatures. So a damp, cold environment is really, is really undesirable. The moisture is often associated with feces, and therefore, urine and feces mix. So you get a lot of ammonia in the environment, which is, again, it's undesirable for lung health and air quality. And generally, moisture and high levels of ammonia, etc., are associated with reduced air quality. If you've got good air changes per hour and the calves are able to keep themselves warm, then humidity isn't, and environmental moisture isn't as big an issue. If you've got really low air changes per hour and you've got cold conditions and you've got lots of environmental humidity, then there's, we're getting a perfect storm here for some really poorly calves. Sources of moisture, the calves themselves, they're on milk, they're consuming large volumes of liquid. That's got to come out somewhere. Milk feeders, commonly automatic feeders, can be really, really messy. Water troughs, calves just mess about with water troughs. Drinkers, they're better, but they'll still somehow find a way of messing about with them. So all these things are sources of liquid in the environment, which you have to cater for through either drainage, extra bedding, increased bedding frequency, or designs that are unique and keep moisture away. This is a really nice picture that shows a calf feeder. It's not just been placed there for this photograph, but if you look around the back of the calf where it stood, that's a really, really clean and dry environment. You see a lot of these, and unfortunately, I haven't got a good photo of one. You see a lot of these when the calf is stood in a wet soup of milk, feces, and urine. Every time it goes to feed, it breathes in a good guts full of ammonia, etc. And calves, being inquisitive, will investigate those puddles, and that's obviously not good for transmission of other diseases either. So that's just a good example of how they can be kept really nice and clean. Okay, so in summary, season prevents calves with the greatest risk of developing pneumonia. So cold, damp, potentially drafty, windy conditions the calves are really up against it in that instance. It's the biggest cause of antibiotic usage in the calf rearing system, and pneumonia is, it's a welfare problem, and it also presents cost challenges as well in terms of treatment and growth rate, etc. So, in summary, from what we've sort of talked about, we must provide primarily fresh air, changed every 8 to 10 times per minute at least, even in cold conditions. We must protect calves from draft, especially in cold conditions. We must protect calves from cold temperatures with bedding, coats, or that's meant to say microenvironments. So areas where they can hide, or potentially sheds within a shed, like an igloo or a large hutch, somewhere they can get warm. And we must keep environmental moisture to a minimum. So those focuses really all will provide for a good environment for calf rearing, or good environment for air quality and lung health. And that's really, it's very basic. A lot of this stuff is from years ago, and it's still, I go out on farm on a daily basis and see calves in either on dairy farms or in calf rearing environments, and still there's in unsuitable environments out there. There are things that can be done. I haven't sort of made great suggestions about how to alter and improve everyone's sheds, because it's very bespoke and it's unique to your shed, and it's a discussion that you need to have with shed designer or vet or somebody that you've got that's interested in and understands what they're doing regarding ventilation. But it's really just retouching those basics and making sure that we've got them will improve the health of calves on farm. References, I've just put 2 there. As I said, have a look at that Better Cattle Housing Design document for AHDB if you're interested. It's a really good document. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. So please do type any questions if you have any, and I'd like to remind you all that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available to watch back on the YouTube channel probably by tomorrow. I'd also like to highlight some extra resources. So we also have the Better Returns from Calf Rearing Manual and the Improving Beef Housing Manual, which is currently being updated. And the BRP Plus range, they can be found online. So we do have a few questions. The first question is, what is the best or optimum temperature you would house calves at?
So different calves of different ages needed different temperatures. So calves of 0 to 4 weeks of age, 0 to 2 weeks of age, let's start there, the very smallest calves, their lower critical temperatures are sort of 8 to 10 degrees. And then it climbs as that calf gets bigger. So in the dead of winter, it's really hard to cater for those calves without putting a coat on them or putting them within their own little micro environment, or bedding them with straws, a bit of a gesture in -5 degrees. It really, so focus, the temperature stress is worst on the lowest, on the smallest calves, and then there isn't an optimum, unfortunately. It's more about size, is kind of my answer to that question.
Thanks, Nick. We've just got a question here. They'd like to see the temperature graph again, please. Could you just flick back?
That one?
Yes, I believe that will be it. Thanks, Nick.
Or no, the lower critical temperature.
Oh, right, yes, that might be it, that one. We'll leave it there and we'll carry on and see if they've got anything else to ask. Going back to the group you worked with AHDB, were all of the calves in the trial BVD tagged and tested?
No, that's a very good point. At that point in time, only one of the farms was doing it. By the end, I think through discussion with their peers and through the discussion with various sort of experts and us just sort of feeling our way through it, by the end I think pretty much all bar one of the group would be engaging in some sort of BVD testing. So really a much better coverage, and some of that's through their supply chain and some of that's off their own back.
Thanks, Nick. And what is the closest distance cattle sheds can be to each other when different sheds are housing mixed ages of cattle to avoid them sharing the same airspace and spreading disease?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Somebody that knows the answer, I think, has asked that question. I off the top of my head, I don't know. I have a feeling. I've seen 18 feet written down somewhere previously. I can't answer that though, I'm afraid. I really can't.
Thanks, Nick. Are there any other aspects of housing that we should be considering apart from the basics that you've mentioned tonight?
So things that perhaps we're not conscious of, I think this is something that's important actually. So lighting and how sheds are lit, not necessarily with bulbs and electricity, but simply how natural light's getting into sheds. I think that definitely has an effect upon calf demeanor. If you've got a sunny day in the winter and you can get sunlight into the shed, it's nothing. I don't, perhaps it's just me as a personal, anthropomorphizing calves, but it's nice to see calves lying in the sun on a cold day in the winter. So lighting, how light gets into the shed, potentially enrichment in the calf environment. I've not seen any I've not seen any results of any research that people are doing, but I know people are trying to show that enrichment in the calf environment is a positive thing. And the floor is really important. So that obviously drives your environmental moisture, the way that the floor drains, slats or wooden, like a wooden slatting system, which is quite common under large hutches or igloos, whether it's on concrete, which is really, really cold. One of the exercises we did with the calf group actually looked at comparing concrete shed and igloo internal and external temperatures, and the concrete sheds took a long time to warm up after cold periods, and that's, you know, one of the thermal aspects of concrete is that it does cool quite a lot and then it takes a long time to warm. So, you know, those sort of things as well are to be taken into account, but air changes are really the most important thing.
Thanks, Nick. That's really interesting. And what are the main diseases that calf rearers that you've been dealing with are seeing at the moment?
So the main causes of pneumonia, the viruses, parainfluenza, RSV, are, you know, always present. We see quite a lot of mycoplasma in the calf rearing environment. That's a real challenge. That's a big cause of antibiotic usage, and there's not an easy fix, I'm afraid, for that. Working with the farm of origin as much as possible is probably the best bet. And then your other bacterial pneumonias, Pasteurella, Histophilus, those are key, you know, key bacterial things to consider, especially if you're considering vaccination.
Thank you. And this is our final question, lest we get any more through. But you've talked a lot about temperature. Should we still be measuring and worried about temperature in store cattle?
In store cattle, so bigger than, if you look on that graph there, the chart that's in front of us there, if you're talking about store cattle as bigger than sort of 300 kilograms, the store animal here is able to maintain growth and not start using calories to keep warm down to -7 degrees. So for the vast majority of and actually, if you think about store size, they're going to be between these two, probably they're going to be more like 400. So for the vast majority of the UK weather conditions, temperature in store cattle is really a serious consideration. They're going to be on rations similar to this, and they're going to sit somewhere between the two. You might get a couple of days that low when your store cattle won't grow, but the risk there presented is pretty small.
Thanks, Nick. We have just had one final question come through. So you've talked about the best practice is to avoid calves sharing air. So the aim should be to avoid mixing calves from different sources. Is there a critical age at which this becomes less important?
For most of the viruses, they will mix them relatively young, and provided they've got immunity from their mothers, they are able to, you know, to clear that infection relatively easily, probably without any clinical signs, and they're going to, you know, go on and have a relatively straightforward path. The problem is that can happen multiple times for calves on their farm of origin for the various viruses. But as soon as you mix those calves with any other farm's strain of all the viruses, even the common colds, they haven't got immunity. So any mixing of cattle really at any age presents a risk. They don't gain immunity to diseases that they've never seen. They will to some degree because some of the strain variation is low, but for most of the diseases, they won't develop an immunity necessarily to John down the road's type of mycoplasma, let's say. So it's a challenge. Mixing cattle from different farm of origin is always going to present a challenge, and you can see that even up to, you know, we see that in finishers mixing animals from a farm that has IBR and a farm that doesn't have IBR. You think that they're out of the woods, you think you're not going to have a problem, 12 months of age plus, they're mixed, and you have an IBR outbreak in the animals that came from the farm that didn't have IBR. So there's always a risk in mixing cattle, I'm afraid.
Thanks, that's really interesting. We are now out of time. That was the last question. So thank you for everybody for listening at home as well. And thanks for presenting tonight, Nick. The recording of this webinar will be emailed in the next day. So in case you would like to recap anything, it will be on email and also on the YouTube channel. So thank you again and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.